Here is your translated script in smooth, fluent English for spoken narration. Some names in history don't just remind us of a person, they evoke an entire era. An era where science was twisted, ethics were stolen, and power was handed to those who no longer feared their own conscience. Today's story is not just about one man who fled for 40 years, but about how the world let justice slip through its fingers. How does a doctor, someone who once swore to save lives, become a symbol of cruelty? And how was he able to disappear right under the watch of countless international intelligence agencies? If you love historical stories told with depth, truth, and the hidden angles few dare to explore, subscribe to History War so you won't miss more journeys like this. A train platform in the middle of a European winter. Snow falls like a thin layer of white dust covering the frozen steel rails. Human breath fades into the air like wisps of smoke. Trains come and go, the grinding of metal echoing like the dry rhythm of the times. Amid this scene, figures in white coats stand, symbols of medicine, symbols of healing, symbols of the oath to protect life. But in that very space, on platforms just like this, there were times when a gloved hand wasn't reaching out to examine a patient, but to point left or right. A nod, a shake of the head, a decision made in seconds, and a human life was sealed by it. How does someone trained to heal become a symbol of inhumanity? How can a medical degree, a Hippocratic oath, and elite university education coexist with such cold-blooded choices between life and death? That question isn't just for one individual, it's for an entire age. We like to believe that evil wears a monstrous face, that it's clearly different from us, that it comes from outside, from a strange place, from someone who's not quite human. But history rarely works so comfortably. Sometimes evil walks in a neat suit. It graduates from college, it writes theses, it speaks the language of science, and in those moments, the line between saving and destroying becomes terrifyingly thin. Medicine is founded on a clear moral principle. First, do no harm. That oath isn't just a ritual, it's an invisible thread linking knowledge to conscience. Science can give people power, but only ethics decide how that power is used. So what happens when that thread is cut? What happens when a political system is strong enough to redefine what counts as harm and what counts as benefit? When some lives are declared a burden, a deviation, or unworthy of existence? When disease is no longer found in cells or microbes, but is assigned to entire communities, entire peoples? In the darkest years of the 20th century, one doctor came to embody that reversal. But if we stop at calling him a monster, we'll miss something far more important. No one is born a symbol of evil. No one appears from nowhere. Every person is shaped by context, by ideology, by the environment they live in and choose to serve. The most terrifying thing isn't the existence of one cruel individual. It's a system large enough to nurture, encourage, and legalize that cruelty. When we look back on this story, we're not just looking at a lab, a prison camp, or a uniform. We're looking at a moment when science was politicized to the point of losing its soul, when seemingly neutral terms like research, genetic improvement, and biological progress were used to mask inhuman decisions. The greatest danger is when everything happens under a false sense of normalcy. Not through screaming, but through silence. Not through chaos, but through cold order. Forms filled out properly, reports submitted on time, professional meetings held as if it were all part of daily routine. In that place, medicine was no longer a place of healing. It became a tool. And when that tool was placed in the hands of an ideology that saw people as means to an end, the consequences didn't stop at individuals. They spread into policies, into laws, into systems. The story we're about to enter isn't a sensational one. It doesn't rely on graphic violence to shock. What makes it haunting is its cold logic. The way everything was justified in academic language. The way people trained to understand the value of life participated in sorting, selecting, and eliminating it. When science divorces itself from ethics, it doesn't become neutral, it becomes dangerous. We often think of science as light, but that light can be bent. It can be guided by goals that no longer center on humanity. And when that happens, instead of illuminating the path, it blinds us, blurs the lines that must be preserved. Behind every decision on that winter platform was a long buildup of ideology. No act exists in isolation. Before the nods that decided fates, there were lectures. Before the research, there were theories. Before the concentration camps, there were books about racial purity. That's why, if we only look at the final moment, the moment of decision, we'll miss the full story. To understand how a doctor could betray his oath, we have to go back in time, back to university lecture halls, back to post-World War I Germany, where humiliation, economic collapse, and the hunger for revival created fertile ground for extremist ideas. There, a seemingly scientific concept began to be inflated into a solution for every social problem: eugenics. At first, it was presented as a way to improve humanity, a method based on genetics to eliminate disease and enhance population quality. Charts, statistics, and biological terminology gave it an air of objectivity. But beneath that objectivity lay a dangerous assumption that some lives are less valuable than others. And once that assumption was accepted in academic circles, once it was taught as unquestionable truth, the ethical boundaries began to shift, little by little. From the winter platform to the university classroom wasn't a sudden leap. It was a path paved with ideas. Ideas repeated often enough, legitimized by academic titles, protected by political power. And once pseudoscience was dressed in the robes of truth, it was no longer a fringe voice. It became the foundation of policy. To understand how darkness consumed Europe, we have to begin with those ideological seeds. Because before the machines of destruction, there were lectures on racial science. Before the life or death decisions on the platform, there were theories claiming that history was a struggle between races. And at the intersection of national crisis and scientific ambition, an entire generation of young doctors was trained, not just to heal, but to believe they were part of a greater mission. That is where the real story begins. After World War I, Germany didn't just lose the war, they lost faith in themselves. Streets that were once lively became filled with veterans missing arms and legs. Inflation soared to the point where people had to bring wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a political document, it was a collective psychological wound. In that atmosphere, the word decline didn't just describe the economy, it described the nation. When a society sinks into deep crisis, it starts searching for explanations. And sometimes simple answers are more tempting than complex truths. If the nation is weak, perhaps the race is weak. If society is in chaos, maybe deviant elements are contaminating the body of the nation. That metaphor, the nation as a biological body, seems harmless at first. But it opened the door to a new way of thinking. Just as diseased organs can be removed to restore health, maybe society too can cut out those deemed unfit. Eugenics didn't originate in the back rooms of a dictatorship. It had already existed in many parts of the world since the late 19th century, discussed at scientific conferences, published in academic journals. But in post-war Germany, it found particularly fertile soil. There, a desperate yearning for national revival fused with emerging genetic theories. Charts of birth rates, tables classifying the normal and the abnormal, studies on mental illness, all were woven into one larger narrative. If the nation was to grow strong, it had to be cleansed. The most dangerous thing wasn't the slogans shouted in public squares. The true danger was when these ideas entered the university lecture halls, when racial science became an official academic subject, when medical students learned about biological differences between human groups, not just as a phenomenon, but as a value system. An entire generation of young doctors began their training in that environment. They studied anatomy, microbiology, and clinical practice. But at the same time, they absorbed a new worldview, that human beings could be ranked, that some lives were worthy and others were burdens, that science could provide an objective basis for moral decisions. Names like Alfred Rosenberg weren't just political figures, they were ideologues trying to systematize hatred into doctrine. In his writings and lectures, he described history as a struggle for survival between races, where purity meant strength and mixing meant decay. As these ideas were repeated, reinforced by state-sponsored research institutes and scientific organizations, the boundary between ideology and scholarship began to blur. Not every scientist believed wholeheartedly. Not every doctor agreed, but many stayed silent. Others compromised, telling themselves they were only focused on the pure science. And that silence created the space for extremist ideas to go mainstream. When the Nazi Party gradually took power in Berlin, they didn't have to build an ideology from scratch. They inherited and extended what had already been cultivated in academic circles. The law for the protection of hereditary health was passed, allowing forced sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit. Medical committees were formed to assess who was fit and who was not. It was all done through forms, signatures, and official seals. Once again, everything unfolded under a veneer of legality. Doctors signed the paperwork. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't issue execution orders. They merely confirmed diagnoses, classified people, followed procedures. But each signature helped power a much larger machine, one where the concept of human value was reduced to biological data. Science, which had been built to search for truth, was now being forced to serve a predetermined conclusion. Research no longer sought to ask questions, but to prove an ideology. Contradictory evidence was ignored. Unfavorable results were discarded. What remained was a form of pseudoscience wrapped in authority. What made this era especially dangerous wasn't its noise, but its reasonableness. Speeches talked about a bright future, national strength, and the responsibility of intellectuals. Scientific conferences continued. Journals kept publishing. On the surface, order and professionalism had not disappeared, but beneath it all, a shift had occurred. People were no longer seen as ends in themselves, but as tools for a collective project. Personal ethics were subordinated to national goals. And when those goals were defined in biological terms, decisions that once belonged to conscience were now framed as scientific necessities. A young doctor in that setting could convince himself he was doing no wrong, that he was contributing to a better future, that the individuals being eliminated were the necessary cost of progress. When language changes, our perception of actions changes too. Cleansing sounds different from eliminating. Special care sounds different from ending. Language became the first tool of legitimization. And so, from sterilization laws, from medical committees, from lectures on racial theory, a next step was being prepared. If the reproduction of the unfit could be prevented, then why not go further? If people could be classified, why not selected? When war broke out, that logic found new space to operate. War created emergencies. And in emergencies, norms are loosened. Once society grew used to seeing some people as biologically different, stripping them of rights became easier. Camps were initially built for political prisoners, but gradually they expanded to include those deemed undesirable. What was once debated in lecture halls was now being applied in real life. It was at the intersection of pseudoscience and absolute power that a new apparatus was born, one that relied not just on ideas, but on organization, discipline, and command. Those who had once studied racial improvement now had the opportunity to implement their beliefs within a system protected by guns and special laws. That was the moment ideology stepped off the page and entered the structure of power. And at the center of that structure was an organization designed to realize every goal of the regime, the SS. No longer academic debates, no more scientific conferences. This was a machine with ranks, tasks, and authority. If the university halls had laid the ideological foundation, the SS provided the organizational machinery. If pseudoscience gave the rationale, this system gave the means. And from here, the story enters a new chapter, where ideas no longer stayed as words, but were put into motion by a destruction machine built with precision, discipline, and a deadly sense of purpose. Once an idea has been legitimized, once pseudoscience has been dressed in the robes of truth, all that remains is a structure powerful enough to turn it into action. And in 1930s Germany, that structure had a name, Schutzstaffel, the SS. Originally, the SS was just a small guard unit assigned to protect Adolf Hitler and the leadership of the Nazi Party. But under the hand of Heinrich Himmler, it was gradually restructured into an empire within the empire. More than just a security force, the SS became a parallel state, with its own military, its own intelligence agency, its own economic apparatus, and most infamously, its own vast network of concentration camps spanning across Europe. Himmler didn't see the SS merely as a military organization. He envisioned it as a secular monastic order for the Aryan race. SS members were selected based on strict racial criteria. They had to prove the purity of their bloodlines across generations. Family histories were scrutinized, genetic records meticulously archived. From the very process of recruitment, the ideology of eugenics was embedded into the DNA of the organization. But what truly set the SS apart wasn't just its recruitment standards. It was the fusion of ideology and discipline. SS members weren't only trained in combat, they were indoctrinated in the Nazi worldview, in their supposed historical mission, in their role in reshaping Europe. Propaganda wasn't a decorative layer, it was the psychological foundation. In such a system, a command was more than a bureaucratic order. It was treated as a manifestation of truth. Alongside the Waffen-SS, the military wing fighting at the front lines, another arm of the SS operated from the shadows, the camp system. These camps were originally built to detain political opponents, but over time their function expanded. Jews, Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, prisoners of war, all could be sent to the same space where the normal laws of society no longer applied. This system operated on a cold clinical principle, compartmentalization of responsibility. Each person was assigned a small, narrow task. The person who made the list didn't guard the prisoners. The guard didn't decide their fate. The decision makers rarely saw the outcomes of their orders. This separation created psychological distance. Hannah Arendt would later call this the banality of evil. But at the time, it was simply considered administrative efficiency. An SS officer could tell himself he was just providing security. A clerk could believe he was just organizing files. A doctor could claim he was merely conducting medical assessments. Each played their part. No one bore the full responsibility, and for that reason the machine continued running smoothly. One especially noteworthy element of that machine was the role of the medical profession. The SS did not see doctors as mere healers. They were tools for enacting the regime's biological policies. Physicians participated in the euthanasia programs, targeting the disabled and mentally ill within German territory. They signed off on lives being labeled as worthless. They oversaw processes designed to eliminate those deemed burdens on society. Clinics became evaluation centers for survival. Diagnosis forms became death sentences. When war erupted in 1939, the SS extended its reach beyond Germany's borders. In occupied territories, their mission wasn't only maintaining order, it was cleansing. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the army, carrying out mass executions. But even these horrific public shootings were soon seen as inefficient, both logistically and psychologically. So, the machine began searching for an industrial solution. It was here that the fusion of ideology, organization, and technology reached a terrifying new level. Concentration camps evolved. No longer just detention centers, they became hubs of forced labor, economic exploitation, and ultimately systematic extermination. German corporations signed contracts with the SS to use prisoners as cheap labor. War economy and racial policy became inseparable. Everything was calculated: labor productivity, minimum caloric intake, expected lifespan of prisoners. Human beings were converted into data points. When one group could no longer work, it was replaced. Within this logic, life was no longer a sacred value. It was a resource. The SS structure allowed this to unfold without ethical interference. Power was concentrated in Himmler and the upper leadership. Below them, all that was expected was obedience. Loyalty was valued over independent thought. Rewards were given to the compliant. Punishment awaited the doubters. In such an environment, many adapted. What once shocked the conscience became routine. What once stirred guilt became habit. The human psyche has an alarming ability to adapt, and that's what makes it so frightening. When everyone around you is doing the same, when superiors encourage it, when propaganda assures you it's for the good of the nation, moral boundaries recede further and further. This machine of destruction wasn't fueled by frenzy. It ran on procedure. There were spreadsheets, targets, regular reports. Camps were expanded, restructured, upgraded. Rail lines were optimized to facilitate prisoner transport. Schedules were streamlined. Bureaucratic language obscured reality. Instead of saying kill, they said special treatment. Instead of sent to die, they said resettlement. Language continued to serve as a shield. Within this structure, an SS doctor was not a bystander. He was a critical link in the chain. Not just to tend to guards, but to evaluate prisoners, participate in selections, oversee experiments deemed valuable for science or military purposes. With a medical degree and SS backing, he had the power to make life and death decisions over others' bodies. And when that power is unchecked by law or independent ethics, it becomes absolute. The true horror lies not only in what happened, but in how meticulously it was prepared. There was no sudden explosion. It advanced step by step, from racial theory lectures to sterilization laws, from political prisons to forced labor systems, from sporadic executions to industrial processes. The SS was the crystallization of that entire journey, an organization where ideology and authority merged, where people were trained to believe they were doing what was necessary, even noble, and in that belief they silenced any voice of inner doubt. But if the SS was the skeleton, the overarching framework, where did this machine operate with its greatest intensity and scale? Where did bureaucratic decisions turn into human experiences of terror, waiting, and uncertainty? The answer lies in a name that has become a global symbol of darkness: Auschwitz. From here, the story leaves abstract systems behind and enters a physical space where every principle of the SS was executed to its fullest, a place where the train platform wasn't just a metaphor, but a cold, literal reality, a place where the machinery of life and death reached its most terrifying perfection. And to understand the full depth of this machinery, we must pass through the gate bearing the words Arbeit macht frei and look directly into the heart of darkness. There are places that transcend the map. Say their name, and people don't think of coordinates. They think of a historical state of being. Auschwitz is one of those names. Located in occupied southern Poland, Auschwitz began as a former Austro-Hungarian military barracks. But in the hands of the SS, it was transformed into a massive complex. Auschwitz I, the main camp. Auschwitz II Birkenau, the center of intake and extermination. Auschwitz III Monowitz, a forced labor site serving industry. Surrounding them were dozens of subcamps, all linked by railway lines and command chains. From above, it looked orderly. Rows of wooden barracks in parallel, barbed wire fences snaking around them, watchtowers at regular intervals. Everything bore the appearance of near military precision. But that order wasn't to protect life. It was to control, to sort, and ultimately, to eliminate. It all began at the platform. Trains arrived from across Europe, crammed with people, packed for hours, sometimes days. Those inside had no clear idea where they were headed. They were told of resettlement, of labor in the East. Their luggage was neatly labeled. Families tried to stay calm for the sake of their children. Many still believed that at worst they were being sent to a harsh work camp. Then the doors opened and a cold light poured in. German barking, dogs snarling, SS officers lined up. And in the center of it all was a single defining moment: selection. No trial, no lawyers, no defense, just a glance. Age, physical condition, capacity to work, a finger pointing left, a finger pointing right. The process happened so fast, most couldn't understand what was happening. Families were split, the elderly and small children were separated, the able-bodied were sent in another direction. It took only minutes. The mechanization of life and death decisions reached its peak. No anger, no drama, just procedure. It was that calm efficiency that made Auschwitz the heart of darkness. Birkenau, the massive expansion of the camp, was built to absorb an unprecedented volume of people. Endless rows of wooden huts, hastily constructed on muddy ground. In winter, winds pierced the gaps in the planks. In summer, the air was suffocating and saturated with stench. Life in the camp was governed by whistles and forced rhythms. Wake before dawn. Roll calls that lasted hours in the snow or rain. Exhausting labor. Minimal rations, enough to survive briefly but never to regain strength. The human body became a graph of decline. But what made Auschwitz uniquely horrifying wasn't just the conditions. It was the combination of labor and systematic extermination. Birkenau was equipped with mass-killing facilities, operating like an assembly line. New arrivals, if not selected for work, were led off under the pretense of showering or disinfection. Sealed chambers, steel doors sealing vents. We don't need to describe what happened next. What matters is the mechanism. Everything was calculated to maximize efficiency and minimize disruption. Even the disposal of corpses was organized. Time, numbers, throughput, industrial terms applied to human lives. At Auschwitz, life became data. Records were kept, registries maintained, daily statistics compiled. The numbers were sent back to Berlin like routine administrative reports. On paper, all you saw were columns and rows, no faces, no cries. Abstraction turned tragedy into management. But inside the camp, fear never truly disappeared. It was a constant hum in the background, the fear of new arrivals not knowing their fate, the fear of those laboring past exhaustion with no end in sight, the fear of being called unexpectedly. Uncertainty became a tool of control. No one knew if they would be alive tomorrow. And in that space, the SS doctors arrived in white coats. They didn't just treat the guards, they conducted selections, oversaw labor conditions, carried out research on prisoners. In a place where names were stripped away and replaced with tattooed numbers, the role of the doctor became a cruel paradox. The symbol of healing stood at the epicenter of destruction. Some focused on keeping prisoners just healthy enough to work. Others engaged in experiments for the sake of war or racial theories. What shocked many witnesses later wasn't just the acts, but the demeanor, the outward politeness, the calm tone during selections, a faint smile before issuing a verdict, the detachment between expression and consequence. At Auschwitz, mechanization wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The death machine required humans to operate, and for humans to keep operating it day after day, they had to adapt. They had to stop seeing the whole picture, focus only on their part. A doctor might say he was merely assessing physical fitness. An officer might say he was just maintaining order. Fragmented responsibility created a cushion between action and conscience. Auschwitz was also where the war economy and genocide converged. Prisoners were sent to work in chemical plants, weapons factories, and mines. Major corporations signed contracts with the SS. Profit and ideology merged. In that logic, human beings were both tools for labor and targets for elimination when no longer useful. What made the system so chilling was that it didn't require personal hatred to function. It just required obedience. There were moments of resistance, acts of courage, efforts to retain some shred of humanity in inhuman conditions. But these happened within a tightly controlled structure. Watchtowers, floodlights, barbed wire, all combined to produce a sense of absolute entrapment. In January 1945, as the Red Army advanced, the SS began destroying evidence and forcing prisoners on death marches away from the camp. But before those gates were abandoned, Auschwitz had already become a symbol of how far a system can go when ethics are removed from the equation. What haunts us most about Auschwitz isn't just the number of victims, it's how it was carried out with such normalcy. Not in madness, not in chaos, but with calculated order. There, science was twisted into a tool, medicine was drawn into a structure of destruction, and those who wore the title of doctor had to confront or evade the most fundamental question: what am I serving? Because ultimately, Auschwitz was not just a place, it was a magnifying mirror, revealing what happens when individuals dissolve into systems, when orders replace thought, when ideology replaces conscience. But to fully understand that darkness, we must go deeper into the mind of one individual. Not to excuse, not to soften, but to examine the psychological mechanism that allowed a doctor to cross that line and still believe he was doing the right thing. How could someone stand on that platform, in the bitter wind, under the gaze of families being torn apart, and not feel they had betrayed their oath? How did they separate professional duty from moral responsibility? That is the question of the next chapter, as we enter the psychology of a doctor at war, and explore the fragmentation of the self that made the unthinkable possible. What unsettles many people most when looking back at Auschwitz isn't just the scale of the crimes, it's the faces of those who carried them out. They weren't always shouting, they weren't always raving mad. Many of them held academic degrees, had families, lived otherwise ordinary lives. Among them were doctors, people who once sat in lecture halls studying physiology, who trained in hospitals, who once took an oath to place human life above all else. So what happens in the mind of such a person? Historian and psychologist Robert J. Lifton, in his research on Nazi doctors, introduced a haunting concept: the doubling of the self. According to him, many of these individuals did not feel like a unified being. They created in their minds an Auschwitz self, a version of themselves that served the system, distinct and separate from their everyday persona. At home, they might be fathers, husbands, they could love music, read books, care for their children. But once they stepped through the gates of the camp, they assumed another role. In that role, moral norms were redefined. What would be considered a crime in civilian life became duty within the special space carved out by war and ideology. This splitting of identity didn't happen overnight. It was built gradually. It started with language. No longer was it killing, it was processing. No longer experiments on humans, but research. Language created distance. It blurred the concrete image of the act, and as the image faded, so did emotional response. Next came ideology. If a doctor believed he was serving the future of his nation, that he was contributing to a grand historical project, then his actions could be framed as noble. The suffering of others, in that distorted logic, became a necessary price to pay. Propaganda played a central role. Through newspapers, lectures, and internal documents, the message was repeated. Jews and other targeted groups weren't merely political opponents, they were biological threats. Once a human being was described as a virus, a parasite, a plague, removing them could be portrayed as a medical act. That metaphor was especially dangerous because it turned violence into treatment. In such an environment, the doctor no longer saw a unique individual in front of him. He saw a case, a specimen, a subject. The stripping away of humanity happened step by step, not in an explosion of hatred, but through the repetition of a particular way of seeing. There was also collective pressure. In a system like the SS, loyalty and obedience were rewarded. Those who questioned could be viewed with suspicion. When every colleague around you behaves by the same logic, speaking out demands a rare kind of courage. Humans are social creatures. We seek acceptance. And when the environment normalizes, the unethical, personal conscience becomes isolated. Lifton found that many doctors did not see themselves as cruel. They didn't wake each morning with the intent to do evil. They saw themselves as professionals, as scientists. They believed they were seizing a rare research opportunity. Some even felt they were working in a calm, systematic way, unlike the chaos of the battlefield. And here we arrive at a painful paradox. Science, which is built on skepticism and evidence, had become a tool for reinforcing predetermined beliefs. Instead of questioning the ideology, many doctors tried to prove it. When results didn't align, they adjusted the methods. When data was uncooperative, they reinterpreted it. Another crucial factor was the gradual nature of the crime. No one began their career at the center of mass extermination. Many passed through intermediate steps, supporting sterilization laws, serving on medical review boards, working in euthanasia programs. Each step was smaller than the last, easier to justify. And after enough steps, the next one seemed less shocking. Humans possess a powerful ability to rationalize. A doctor might tell himself that if he didn't do it, someone else would, that at least he could do it more humanely, that in wartime all norms are suspended. These justifications don't make the actions right, but they helped the actor live with them. The terrifying part is the separation between professional knowledge and moral awareness. When medical training focuses too heavily on technique without a solid ethical foundation, skill can exist independent of conscience. A doctor might be highly skilled in anatomy, but if he accepts that some lives aren't worth protecting, that knowledge becomes dangerous. War accelerates everything. Crisis creates urgency. Urgency creates exceptions, and exceptions, if prolonged, become the new normal. SS doctors didn't operate in a vacuum. They were products of an era where ideology penetrated every layer of life. But to understand the psychology is not to absolve. On the contrary, it underscores that humans can adapt to inhumanity if boundaries aren't clearly drawn, and that's why maintaining those boundaries is vital. Auschwitz shows us what happens when those boundaries are erased entirely. But the story doesn't end there. History kept moving. The Eastern Front began to shift. The Red Army drew closer. The sound of artillery echoed from afar. In the final months of the war, the atmosphere within the SS began to shift. Some still clung to hope for victory. Others began preparing for collapse. Documents were burned, records destroyed, evidence erased, and for many doctors within the system, the question was no longer how to serve the regime, but how to survive its fall. The psychological doubling that had allowed them to function at Auschwitz now faced a new test. When the Auschwitz self was no longer protected by authority and weapons, what would happen to the person behind it? Would they feel guilt, or would they continue to convince themselves that they were merely a small cog in the machine? As Berlin trembled and the walls of power began to crack, many chose the path of escape, new identities, new papers, a new life, far away. And in the post-war chaos with Allied forces facing countless urgent priorities, not every crime was immediately pursued. From here, the story enters a new chapter, a chapter of collapse and escape. A system unravels, but those who once served it now seek to vanish into the crowd of the post-war world. January 1945. Winter cast a dull gray blanket of snow over Poland. From the east, the Soviet Red Army's artillery rumbled closer each day. The railways that once carried people into Auschwitz now trembled with the momentum of a new chapter. In SS offices, the atmosphere shifted. No more confident reports about the final solution. In their place, emergency meetings, orders to destroy records, and hasty plans for retreat. When a system built on absolute power begins to crack, panic doesn't explode all at once. It seeps in through small details. Crematoria were blown up to erase traces. Documents burned by night. Prisoners forced to march through the ice, exhausted footsteps stretching for miles. The SS wasn't just retreating, they were trying to erase evidence of what had occurred. But history cannot be burned like paper. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet Army entered Auschwitz. What they found was not a machine in motion, but the wreckage it left behind. Rows of abandoned wooden barracks, warehouses filled with shoes and clothing, prisoners barely alive in a state of collapse. The world began to glimpse the truth. But elsewhere, the people who had run that machine were already trying to disappear. The collapse of the Third Reich came faster than many expected. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The apparatus of power disintegrated. Yet paradoxically, that very chaos created opportunity for those fleeing. Post-war Europe was a continent in ruins, millions displaced, borders redrawn, records lost, refugee camps sprang up everywhere. The Allied forces were overwhelmed, rebuilding infrastructure, restoring political order, managing prisoners of war, addressing humanitarian crises. In that vast landscape, tracking down individual perpetrators, even those tied to the most heinous crimes, was not always the top priority. Many SS members were captured and put on trial. The Nuremberg trials became a symbol of international justice, but the SS had numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Not all were immediately identified. Some discarded their documents, shed their uniforms, and slipped into the refugee stream. Others were detained, but misclassified due to missing information. Some lied about their pasts, claiming they were mere foot soldiers doing clerical tasks. In this climate, identity became a fragile concept. Wartime documents could be replaced, names altered, administrative records in many regions had been destroyed by bombing. The lack of coordination between the Allied occupation zones, American, British, French, Soviet, created gaps. Each zone had its own priorities, its own intelligence agencies. Not all information was shared promptly. And then came a new, decisive factor, rarely discussed but deeply consequential. The Cold War was beginning. Even as the fires of World War II smoldered, tensions between the West and the Soviet Union were already rising. Germany was divided. Berlin became a symbol of a bipolar world. In this context, some former Nazis were no longer seen purely as war criminals, but as potential assets. Sources of information on the Soviets, military technology, intelligence networks. Not every case followed this pattern, but political priorities increasingly overshadowed the drive for thorough justice. Resources were limited. A new enemy was emerging, and within this strategic shift, some individuals found their opening. For those deeply involved in Auschwitz and the SS system, the question was no longer how to serve the regime, but how to sever themselves from it. Some remained in Europe, living under their real names while concealing their roles. Others sought to leave the continent altogether. Secret routes began to emerge, networks later known as the rat lines. These weren't always organized in a centralized way. Sometimes they were loose alliances of former officers, sympathetic clergy, silent supporters, and legal migration channels being exploited. Fake passports, temporary travel documents, new identities, all formed a path out of Europe. From ports in Italy and Spain, ships set sail for South America. For many, it wasn't just a journey of geography, it was a rebirth. The bitter irony was that while survivors tried to rebuild their lives from the rubble, those who had served in the machinery of annihilation could sometimes start anew. Not all succeeded, not all escaped, but enough did to leave an open wound in the pursuit of justice. It's also important to recognize that hunting war criminals is a complex task. It requires evidence, witnesses, international cooperation. In many cases, detailed information about individual roles was missing. Files were lost. Witnesses scattered. Memories scarred. In that vacuum, time became an ally of the fugitives. Some lived quietly under assumed names. Some built new careers. A few even continued to practice medicine elsewhere. The psychological doubling that once allowed them to operate in Auschwitz now served to separate their past from their present. They could convince themselves the war was over, that they had played only a minor role, that the world should move on. But memory does not yield so easily to forgetfulness. Meanwhile, war crimes investigators began their pursuit. Names like Simon Wiesenthal became symbols of tireless effort to bring perpetrators into the light. Yet these hunts were not always fully backed by governments. International politics, strategic interests, and post-war fatigue often slowed the wheels of justice. The collapse of the Third Reich did not mean the immediate fall of all who had served it. The system crumbled, but the people remained. And in a post-war world full of upheaval, they found ways to adapt. Some were caught and tried. Some lived out their lives in shadows. And some chose another continent, far from Europe, far from the winter platforms, far from Auschwitz's memory. Across the Atlantic, there were nations seeking labor, professionals, even anti-communist symbols. Some governments opened their doors for reasons ranging from economic to political. South America, with its geographical distance and pre-existing German expatriate communities, gradually became a destination. And there, under different skies in new cities, the story of escape entered another chapter. No longer in war-torn Europe, but in a promised land for those eager to bury the past. From here, we'll follow the trails that led southward, where history, politics, and silence converged, where crimes thought to be closed continued to smolder in the shadows of another continent. When ships left post-war European ports, they carried more than suitcases and new documents. They carried the past, a past many passengers on board were trying to bury beneath false names and carefully rewritten stories. South America in the late 1940s and early 1950s was no wild frontier. It was a continent of young nations, each seeking its own path to progress, many eager to industrialize rapidly. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, all had established German expatriate communities long before the war. German-speaking neighborhoods, churches, schools, cultural clubs, they formed a ready-made social network. In that context, a European man with valid papers, a professional trade, and a conveniently simplified backstory wasn't hard to accept. Argentina under Juan Domingo Perón is especially notable. Perón pursued a political path blending nationalism, social reform, and a desire for independence from major world powers. He sought to attract European professionals to support industrial and military projects. In that wave of immigration, not everyone was screened thoroughly. It's important to acknowledge, not all South American governments actively protected war criminals. But loose immigration controls combined with rat lines, escape networks, and the help of sympathetic individuals created fertile ground for evasion. In Buenos Aires, cafes, restaurants, and German cultural clubs became meeting points. In those spaces, memories of the Third Reich were sometimes recalled with nostalgia, as if it were a tragic yet grand chapter in German history. Geographical distance helped blur the images of snowy platforms and barbed wire fences. Some lived quietly, keeping to the shadows. Others integrated quickly, working in engineering, commerce, even medicine. Their new identities gradually became more familiar than the old ones. But the past didn't fully disappear. It lived on in overlooked records, in the testimonies of survivors, in the memories of those who endured. And while many governments focused on Cold War priorities, fighting communism, rebuilding economies, stabilizing politics, some individuals and organizations remained committed to justice. Simon Wiesenthal was one of the most prominent among them. He had no army, no state power. What he had were files, correspondence, and a near-obsessive resolve. For Wiesenthal and others like him, the pursuit of war criminals wasn't just a legal task. It was a moral imperative, a declaration that history could not be erased by distance. Yet between ideals and reality, there's always a gap. Western intelligence agencies, in some cases, had knowledge of former Nazis residing in South America. But strategic priorities didn't always align with the pursuit of justice. When facing off against the Soviet Union became the main focus, old files were sometimes pushed aside. Some cases, like Adolf Eichmann, eventually reached the world stage. His capture and trial in Israel in 1961 shocked the global conscience. It showed that justice could cross borders, but it also underscored how many others remained at large. South America thus became a symbol of dual meaning. For some, it was a place to start over. For victims, it was a sign of unfinished business. Communities of former Nazis weren't always hidden, but they weren't completely public either. Rumors circulated. Names were whispered in small news reports. Anonymous letters reached embassies. Yet turning rumors into legal action required solid evidence and international cooperation, neither easy in such a politically tangled context. In Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, various post-war regimes leaned toward authoritarian or military rule. Their priorities lay in internal stability and economic development, not prosecuting foreign war criminals. In some instances, ignoring or even sheltering former Nazis was seen as an act of defiance against global superpowers. It's also worth noting that many local citizens either didn't know or didn't care about these immigrants' true pasts. To them, these were just quiet European men with strange accents and strong work ethics. As time passed, Europe's war faded from immediate memory in this part of the world, and time was the most valuable tool in the escape strategy. With every year that passed, witnesses aged, records were lost, public attention shifted to new crises. The nuclear age, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the shadow of Auschwitz seemed to fade from the headlines of a fast-moving world. But for survivors, it never faded. In Jewish communities across Israel, the US, and Europe, the memory of the camps remained vivid. Names were repeated, faces sketched from memory. And when word surfaced that someone who once stood on a platform at Auschwitz now lived peacefully under the South American sun, the outrage was not easily soothed. South America became a quiet battleground between two forces, one determined to bury the past, the other refusing to let it be forgotten. The ethical question grew sharper. Is there an expiration date on justice? After how many years does a crime become merely history? Should present-day political stability outweigh the need to pursue actions from decades earlier? There are no easy answers, but these questions could not be ignored. In the shadows of South American cities, some believed they had escaped. They changed names, started families, had children. They could sit on porches in the afternoon sun, listening to ocean waves or tropical birds, convincing themselves that history had forgotten them. But elsewhere, the files remained open. Names were underlined, the smallest clues were followed. Sometimes just an old photo, a stray testimony, a matching signature. And from that persistence, a pursuit began to take shape, one that would span decades. Not a loud campaign from the start, but a steady, often frustrating process filled with setbacks, false leads, and dead ends. South America may have been a refuge, but it was not the end of the story, because history, however slowly, has its way of returning. And from here, the story enters its next chapter. The chapter of a 40-year manhunt, where justice is no longer just an ideal, but a very real struggle between memory and forgetting. Some manhunts last weeks, others stretch across months, but there are names so haunting, so deeply embedded in the shadows of history, that the pursuit of them becomes the story of an entire generation. 40 years, nearly half a century, is more than a span of time. It is a test of memory, of will, and of the very meaning of justice. After the war ended, the name Josef Mengele wasn't immediately prioritized on global most wanted lists. The SS had too many personnel. Records were missing, witnesses were scattered. In the early post-war years, the focus was on major trials, the ministers, the generals, the visible architects of the regime. But over time, as survivors of Auschwitz began recounting their memories in greater detail, especially of the doctor on the platform, his name surfaced again and again, wrapped in something beyond legal infamy. Not just a war criminal, a symbol. Prosecutors in West Germany, war crimes investigators, and individuals like Simon Wiesenthal began collecting evidence. Rumors pointed to Argentina, then Paraguay, later Brazil. Each lead sparked hope, then often ended in silence. This wasn't an action thriller. It was a trail of unanswered letters, delayed dossiers, and extradition requests bogged down in diplomatic procedure. International politics lurked behind every turn. A government might hesitate to stir tensions over a decades-old crime. An intelligence agency might prioritize Cold War strategies over historical accountability. There were moments when justice seemed within reach. In 1960, when Mossad captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires and brought him to trial in Jerusalem, the world was shaken. The Eichmann trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a collective reckoning with the Holocaust. In that climate, one question quickly followed. If Eichmann could be found, why not the others? There were reports that Israeli intelligence had clues about Mengele's whereabouts in Argentina, but resources were limited. At that time, Israel faced urgent existential threats, regional wars, hostile neighbors, national survival. Tracking every fugitive Nazi wasn't always the top priority. In West Germany, prosecuting Nazi crimes was no less complex. The country wrestled with its own past. Many former Nazi party members still held positions within the bureaucracy. Fatigue and a desire to move on sometimes dulled the urgency for justice. Yet by the 1960s and 70s, pressure began mounting from abroad and from Germany's own youth. The question, "What did our fathers do?" echoed across universities. Each time a survivor of Auschwitz spoke of the platform, the selections, the experiments, Mengele's name returned. He was no longer just a man. He was the face of scientifically sanctioned cruelty. And that made the manhunt more than personal. It was symbolic. Throughout the 60s and 70s, international press occasionally reported new leads. A blurry photo said to be taken in Paraguay. A witness claimed to recognize someone in São Paulo. A letter sent to his family in Germany. Each hint rekindled hope, and each time the trail vanished into darkness. At certain points, it seemed as though he had simply disappeared from the world. No public statements, no community involvement. He lived quietly, changing locations, protected by the networks of former Nazis and loyal relatives. Time passed, his hair turned gray, but the memories of his victims did not. The 40-year hunt stretched on for many reasons. In part because he was skilled at disappearing, in part because of legal and diplomatic loopholes, and in part because international politics didn't always align with historical justice. A difficult question emerged. Does justice have an expiration date? If someone has lived decades under a false identity, is it still meaningful to bring them to trial? For survivors, the answer was unequivocal. There is no statute of limitations on genocide. There is no too late for the truth. In the final years of the search, German and Brazilian authorities began cooperating more closely. The name Wolfgang Gerhard surfaced, a man living in Brazil with ties to the German expatriate community. When he died, suspicion increasingly focused on his true identity. As investigators tried to piece together the puzzle, a stark realization grew. The man they had hunted for 40 years might already be dead. And so the manhunt carried a bitter paradox. It proved that memory could outlast time, but it also showed that justice does not always arrive in time to face the accused in court. Still, even without a trial, the search carried meaning. It sent a message that history cannot be easily buried, that names bound to atrocity will not rest in peace simply because time has passed or borders have shifted. And then in the late 1970s, on a beach in Brazil, the story took a quiet turn. Not in a courtroom, not under the flashbulbs of international media, but in an ordinary moment of life. The man who had been pursued across 3 continents collapsed suddenly while swimming. There were no handcuffs, no charges read aloud. Just a silent death under a false name in a distant cemetery. And from there, the story entered its next chapter. Not the race to capture, but the effort to prove the truth, once and for all. February 1979. On a beach near São Paulo, Brazil, the waves lapped steadily against damp sand. It was a day like any other. No alarms, no knocks in the middle of the night, just sunlight, salt water, and a middle-aged man stepping into the sea for a swim like countless others. Then he collapsed. According to accounts later gathered, he may have suffered a stroke while in the water. His body sank, was pulled from the waves, but too late. The name on the papers was Wolfgang Gerhard, a quiet German immigrant, unremarkable in the local community. But that name was only a mask. If later suspicions were correct, the man who died quietly on that beach was none other than Josef Mengele, the man from the Auschwitz platform, the fugitive hunted for 40 years, the face of science perverted in the shadow of war. The bitter irony was that his death didn't happen in a courtroom. There was no prosecutor, no official charges read in his presence, no moment for survivors to speak their truth, no verdict delivered, just a body buried under a false name in a Brazilian cemetery. For many survivors and their families, this was a heartbreak beyond words. Not because they sought revenge, but because a trial is not just punishment. It is a public record of truth, a chance for history to confront justice, a space for victims to be heard. When Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem, millions around the world watched. The testimony of survivors echoed through the courtroom, etching the Holocaust into global memory. But with Mengele, there was no such moment. For years after the 1979 death, uncertainty lingered. Was he really dead? Or was it just a decoy? Rumors continued. Some claimed he had fled to Paraguay. Others believed he was still hiding somewhere in the remote wilderness of South America. His family in Germany remained silent. The Nazi networks that once sheltered him were tight-lipped, and without a formally confirmed body, his death remained at first a story, unproven. Here, once again, we encounter the complexities of historical justice. No trial, no confession, just a natural death, or so the medical records suggested, after 3 decades of post-war life under a stolen identity. It raises a troubling question. Can time become a kind of shield? Can someone live out the better part of their life after participating in atrocity and never stand face-to-face with justice? For some, his death was evidence that he ultimately couldn't outrun history. But for many others, it left a void. No opportunity to ask why. No chance to force him to listen to the stories of those he harmed. And yet, even in that silence, death didn't fully close the case. One question still hovered. How can we be sure? In 1985, German and Brazilian investigators decided to exhume the grave marked Wolfgang Gerhard. The body was recovered for analysis. Bones, teeth, morphological traits, all were examined. Forensic experts began comparing the remains with old medical records and photos of Josef Mengele. It was a turning point, because in a cruel twist of fate, it was science, once abused by Mengele to serve a genocidal ideology, that would now be used to reveal the truth of who he was. Once the body was exhumed, the story moved out of rumor and into the lab. And in that space, it wasn't ideology or politics that spoke. It was physical evidence. Initial analyses showed strong matches: dental structure, skeletal characteristics, medical history. But a final confirmation was needed. It wasn't until 1992, with the use of more advanced DNA testing compared against samples from Mengele's family, that a definitive conclusion was reached. The man buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard was, in fact, Josef Mengele. The truth wasn't delivered in a courtroom, but in a laboratory. His death in the shadows, then, was not the end. It opened a new chapter, one in which science, no longer a tool of destruction, became a tool of verification. Not to save him, not to excuse him, but to silence doubt and place a final period on a question that had lingered for decades. From there, the story deepens even further. If science was once warped to justify hierarchy and cruelty, it had now been reclaimed, to identify, to confirm, to confront. The next chapter, then, is not just about an exhumed body. It is about the strange and tragic irony of history, when the very field that was weaponized in the service of ideology is used to affirm historical justice. And that's where we continue, in the laboratory, where forensics and scientific truth meet the lingering specter of the past. When the grave marked Wolfgang Gerhard was opened in 1985, the small cemetery in Brazil bore no resemblance to a courtroom. There were no TV cameras, no shouted slogans, only investigators, forensic experts, and a question that had hung in the air for decades. Was this truly Josef Mengele? 40 years of pursuit had come down to a skeleton. It was one of history's great ironies. A man who once used the name of science to justify inhuman acts was now being examined under the light of real science, not to serve ideology, not to classify human beings, but to uncover the truth. Experts began with traditional forensic anthropology. They measured the skull, analyzed bone structure, compared details with archived photos and wartime medical records. Small clues, an old fracture, an unusual dental feature, signs of known illnesses, gradually formed a picture. Forensic science does not operate on emotion. It relies on physical evidence. Every bone, every tooth, every trace was placed in a comparative context. There was no room for rumor, no place for speculation. But in the mid-1980s, DNA analysis was not yet widely available or precise. Initial conclusions relied heavily on morphological comparisons and dental records. The results showed a high level of consistency with known data on Mengele. But in a case of such global significance, doubts persisted. Could it be a mistake? Could someone have been switched in his place? It wasn't until 1992, with the emergence of more advanced DNA techniques, that scientists were able to compare samples from the skeleton to living relatives of Mengele in Germany. This time, the result was near irrefutable. The genetic match was overwhelming. The man buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard was Josef Mengele. There was no gavel strike, but there was a clear scientific verdict. The irony couldn't be deeper. Science, once twisted into a weapon to serve ideology, had reclaimed its original purpose. Science does not pledge allegiance to politics. It does not seek to justify belief. It simply seeks truth through evidence. And in that laboratory, a powerful message rang out. Truth may be delayed, but it cannot be buried forever. For the families of victims, the DNA result did not bring a trial. It did not bring confession, but it ended uncertainty. No more rumors that he might still be out there, no more second escape. History was confirmed by material proof. Still, this story was never just about a name. It raised a larger question. How did science's ethics unravel so far in the 20th century that a doctor could go that far? And more importantly, what has the world learned since? After World War II, the Nuremberg trials did not only prosecute generals and ministers, they also tried doctors who had conducted inhumane experiments. From those trials came the Nuremberg Code, a brief, revolutionary document that laid down a basic rule. Voluntary consent of the human subject is essential. It was a direct response to the abuse of science. Later, the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association reinforced the ethics of medical research. Ethics boards were formed in hospitals and universities. All human research was now subject to independent review. No longer could a vague promise of greater good override individual rights. These changes did not erase the past, but they showed that society can learn if it dares to confront its own failings. In Mengele's case, forensic science did what the legal system could not. It confirmed the truth. There was no prison sentence, but there was an unshakable historical verification, and that carried profound symbolic weight. If Auschwitz showed what happens when science is politicized and detached from ethics, then the 1992 lab results showed what happens when science is guided by transparency and verification, the same methods, the same knowledge of the human body, but with opposite intent. One was used to classify and destroy, the other to identify and illuminate. We often say science is neutral, but in reality, science always exists within an ethical frame. A tool does not choose its purpose. The intent lies with its user. When that intent is fueled by hate and power, science becomes a weapon. When it seeks truth and defends human dignity, science becomes the foundation of justice. So the forensic confirmation of Mengele's identity is more than a technical detail. It's a symbol of reversal, of reclaiming science from those who once corrupted it. Still, even with the identity confirmed, the question of legacy remains. A death in the shadows is no substitute for a public trial. But the world's legal and ethical legacy after the Holocaust does not rest solely on whether one man was sentenced. It rests on how new principles were established and upheld. From the Nuremberg Code to today's international criminal courts, the global community has forged a guiding principle. Genocide and crimes against humanity have no expiration date. No matter how long a perpetrator runs, the crime does not vanish with time. And here, Mengele's story connects to a much broader reckoning. Not just the story of a doctor in wartime, but a turning point in how the world understands research ethics, personal responsibility, and the limits of state power. From the lab where DNA spoke, we now enter the next chapter, the legacy of law and ethics. A place where principles are etched not just to remember the past, but to protect the future. When the courtroom doors at Nuremberg closed in the late 1940s, the world witnessed more than the sentencing of a few individuals. It witnessed a turning point in legal and moral history. For the first time, the international community declared that certain crimes stood above national sovereignty, above the defense of just following orders, above all political rationale. Crimes against humanity. Before that, the term hardly existed in international law. But after Auschwitz, after laboratories were turned into sites of human abuse, It became a principle that could no longer be ignored. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg held particular weight. There, men who once acted in the name of science were forced to answer a basic question. Can knowledge exist outside of ethics? Can state orders justify the violation of human bodies and dignity? The answer was inscribed into the Nuremberg Code, a brief document, but every line etched into the collective memory of humankind. The first and most important principle: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. No scientific goal, no matter how noble, can override the free, informed consent of the individual. It was a direct response to what had occurred in the camps. The Nuremberg Code was not just a legal document. It was an admission that science, if not bound by ethics, can slide into inhumanity. It reminded the world that knowledge does not automatically lead to progress. Only when paired with responsibility does it become a tool for sustainable development. Building on that foundation, more international frameworks followed. The Declaration of Helsinki, issued by the World Medical Association in 1964, expanded and detailed the principles of research involving human subjects. Ethics committees were established in hospitals, universities, and research institutes. The idea of independent review became standard. No research project could proceed without a formal assessment of risks and benefits. Behind these seemingly dry regulations lay the memory of Auschwitz. The legal legacy of the post-war era extended beyond medicine. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1948, confirmed that genocide was a crime under international law, regardless of where it occurred. No state could invoke sovereignty to shield the destruction of a people. Later, the creation of the International Criminal Court carried forward the Nuremberg spirit, that there are universal norms binding on all of humanity, not to justify interference, but to set limits on power. One of the most critical principles established was this: genocide and crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations. Time does not diminish the gravity of the act. Whether the perpetrator lives for 30, 40, or 50 more years, they remain accountable. In that context, the story of Josef Mengele, even without ending in a courtroom, helped shape legal awareness. He became a symbol of evasion, but also a testament that the world would not stop searching for truth. The 40-year pursuit sent a message: memory can outlast concealment. But the ethical legacy lives not just in laws. It lives in how future generations approach science and power. Today, as medicine advances at unprecedented speed, gene editing, artificial intelligence, massive biological data, the question of ethical boundaries is once again urgent. The memory of the 20th century reminds us, progress does not always equal good. Every technical leap must be weighed against fundamental questions. Whom does this serve? Who decides? Who may be harmed? Auschwitz showed what happens when a society accepts the ranking of human life by biological value. The post-war legal legacy insists that human dignity is inviolable, regardless of race, religion, health, or labor capacity. Perhaps most importantly, Nuremberg changed how we think about personal responsibility. Defendants often claimed, "I was just following orders," but the tribunal established a new standard. Following orders is not a defense for grave crimes. This principle remains deeply relevant. It asserts that in any system, whether a government, military, or research institution, the individual remains ethically responsible for their actions. No bureaucracy is large enough to erase a conscience. That legacy is more than laws and courts. It is a continuous warning, a warning that the silence of the majority can enable evil. That over-specialization, if disconnected from ethics, can blind people to the larger picture. That when language is distorted, when cleansing replaces elimination or research masks violation, we must be on guard. The story of a doctor once standing on the Auschwitz platform is not just a closed chapter. It's a living reminder of the fragile line between knowledge and power. The legal and ethical legacy of the 20th century is not perfect. The world continues to face conflict, human rights abuses, and new tragedies. But compared to the pre-Nuremberg era, we now have a clearer legal vocabulary, stronger international tools, and a deeper collective awareness of moral boundaries. One could say that today's ethical standards in research are direct responses to what once happened. Every time an ethics board requests a study revision, Every time a patient receives full disclosure before a clinical trial, every time a scientist questions the social consequences of their work. That is the invisible legacy of a dark age. And perhaps that is the deepest form of justice. Not just the verdict against one man, but a lasting transformation in how humanity understands its responsibilities. Science is no longer seen as a neutral realm, detached from morality. It is recognized as a human enterprise, accountable to human rights. That legacy does not erase the pain, but it turns that pain into principle. And when we look back from the winter platform in Europe, through the twisted laboratories to a quiet grave in Brazil and a DNA lab, we understand justice does not come only from the court. It comes from memory, from law, and from the vigilance of those who follow. Because in the end, the most important question is not whether one man was convicted. It is whether humanity learned enough never to let it happen again. Some verdicts are delivered in courtrooms, others are written into the law. But there are also verdicts that come not from a judge, not from a gavel striking wood, but from history itself. And history, though slow, rarely forgets. The story of Josef Mengele didn't close with a public trial. It ended with a grave under a false name and a DNA confirmation years later. There was no moment of reckoning between perpetrator and victim, no confession captured in court transcripts. For many, that absence feels incomplete. But when we look deeper, we realize that justice does not only exist in legal form. Justice also lives in memory, in the memories of survivors who continue to tell their stories, no matter how painful, in the memories preserved by historians who sift through archives and documents, in the collective memory of society through museums, memorials, and textbooks that keep victims' names alive. Auschwitz is no longer an active concentration camp, but it remains a symbol, a warning that science can be corrupted, that ethics can erode, little by little, that the silence of the majority can create fertile ground for evil. In the 21st century, we live in a very different world. Technology evolves at lightning speed. Artificial intelligence, gene editing, big data, concepts once confined to science fiction are now reality. But because of that, ethical questions have never been more urgent. History teaches us that knowledge alone does not guarantee humanity. Only when guided by responsibility does it truly serve people. This story is not just about one man, it's about a system. About how an entire society can descend into darkness when hatred is dressed up as science, when unchecked power goes unchallenged, when people are sorted by biological value. But it's also about resilience, how the world responded with new laws, new standards, and a renewed commitment to never let it happen again. But never again is not a magic spell. It's a promise that must be renewed. Every generation must ask itself, are we vigilant enough? Do we question authority when it overreaches? Do we defend human dignity even when it's inconvenient? Perhaps the biggest lesson isn't how long Mengele evaded justice or where he died. The real lesson is what allowed him to become who he was in the first place. And would we recognize the same patterns if they appeared again, just in a different form? Justice is born from memory because memory forces us to face the truth. It denies us the comfort of forgetting. It refuses to let us say, that was the past, it has nothing to do with us now. Every time a society starts labeling people by their worth, every time language begins to blur reality, every time the greater good is used to strip away individual rights, memory must speak. And that's why telling stories like this is not about reopening old wounds. It's about staying awake. It's a reminder that darkness doesn't arrive all at once. It grows in the quiet space of small compromises. History isn't a closed book, it's a mirror. And in that mirror, we see not just the past, but our own potential. The potential to do wrong and the potential to make it right. Josef Mengele may have died in obscurity, never facing a courtroom, but he did not escape history's judgment. His name is forever tied to the betrayal of the medical oath. And every time the world reaffirms the ethics of human research, every time a doctor swears to put the patient first, it's a silent rebuttal of what he once stood for. In the end, the question is not whether he was an angel or a ghost. The question is, what will we choose to become when faced with power and knowledge? Will we have the courage to say no when the system demands inhumanity? Will we have the patience to protect our principles when they're called obstacles? This story ends here, but our reflection shouldn't. If you believe the lessons of history still matter, if you believe that understanding the past is one of the best ways to protect the future, leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective, your questions, even your critiques, they all help deepen this conversation. And if you'd like to continue exploring the turning points of history with us, not just to learn what happened, but to understand why it happened, consider subscribing to History War. Because every story we revisit isn't just a glimpse into the past, it's a reminder for the present. Justice may arrive slowly, but as long as memory is alive, it's never truly absent.